The Texas borderlands, a place where the vast, star-dusted sky felt as menacing as it was beautiful, and where the night winds carried more than just dust and the scent of creosote. They carried whispers, old and fearful, of LECHUZA', the owl witch, a shape-shifting horror that plucked children from their beds, her mournful cry a harbinger of doom. I'm Ryder. The whispers had become screams in a string of hushed-up disappearances, and a faint, almost erased data fragment from the agency's archives had pinged this desolate stretch of land. Coincidence? Unlikely. I'd come to see if the terrifying legend was just that, or if something far more tangible stalked these lonely nights. More importantly, I needed to know if the agency's fingerprints were on this nightmare, and why. The cry of LECHUZA' was waiting, and I had a sinking feeling it wasn't just a story. The Texas borderlands, a place where the vast, star-dusted sky felt as menacing as it was beautiful, and where the night winds carried more than just dust and the scent of creosote. They carried whispers, old and fearful, of LECHUZA', the owl witch, a shape-shifting horror that plucked children from their beds, her mournful cry a harbinger of doom. I'm Ryder. The whispers had become screams in a string of hushed-up disappearances, and a faint, almost erased data fragment from the agency's archives had pinged this desolate stretch of land. Coincidence? Unlikely. I'd come to see if the terrifying legend was just that, or if something far more tangible stalked these lonely nights. More importantly, I needed to know if the agency's fingerprints were on this nightmare, and why. The cry of LECHUZA' was waiting, and I had a sinking feeling it wasn't just a story. The town of Ocaso felt like it was holding its breath. Dust devils danced down the main street, past storefronts with faded paint and windows that seemed to watch with vacant, fearful eyes. It wasn't a ghost town, not yet, but the life was being slowly choked out of it. The few locals I encountered averted their gaze, their faces tight with a shared, unspoken anxiety. This wasn't the boisterous, independent Texas spirit I'd read about. This was a community cowering under a shadow. I'd checked into a rundown motel on the edge of town, the kind where the Gideon Bible in the drawer looked like it had seen more despair than salvation. The clerk, a gaunt man with a nervous tic, had paled when I'd casually asked about local folklore. "Some things, best left undisturbed, mister," he'd muttered, his eyes darting towards the darkening windows. LECHUZA'. The name itself seemed to conjure the chill. A bruja, a witch who could transform into a monstrous owl, sometimes with the face of an old woman, its eyes burning like coals. They said she'd been a woman wronged, seeking revenge, or perhaps a mother whose own children were lost, now driven by an insatiable, twisted grief to steal others. Her cry, a mournful whistle or a woman's wail, was an omen. If she called your name, death or misfortune was soon to follow. And her favored prey? Children. Hackreys. The official reports, the ones that made it past the local sheriff's tight lips, spoke of runaways or tragic accidents. But the posters plastered on lampposts and in the dusty window of the general store told a different story. Smiling young faces, usually under the stark heading, missing. Too many of them for a town this small. As dusk began to bleed across the immense Texas sky, painting it in bruised purples and oranges, an oppressive silence fell over Ocaso. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. The only sounds were the mournful sigh of the wind and the distant yelping of coyotes. I sat by my motel room window, watching the shadows lengthen, my hand resting near the familiar weight of the agency-issue pistol I still carried. My skepticism was a well-worn coat, but the fear in this town was a tangible thing, almost a physical presence. And as the last light faded, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there, in the vast, dark expanse, was watching and waiting. Dawn in Ocaso brought a temporary reprieve from the night's oppressive dread, but the underlying tension remained. I started my inquiries at the local diner, a place called the Dusty Spoon, hoping the morning coffee might loosen some tongues. It didn't. The few patrons, Weathered ranchers and tired-looking women spoke in hushed tones, casting wary glances my way. My attempts to steer the conversation towards the missing children or the local legends were met with curt nods, mumbled deflections, or an abrupt, uncomfortable silence. Folks round here are superstitious. The waitress, a young woman named Maria with haunted eyes, finally offered in a low voice as she refilled my mug. They don't like talking about certain things. She wouldn't elaborate, her gaze flicking nervously towards the other customers. It became clear that direct questioning was a dead end. The fear of LECHUZA wasn't just a campfire story. It was a deeply ingrained terror, a taboo. To speak its name too loudly was to invite its attention. I shifted tactics, focusing on public records at the small, underfunded county clerk's office. The official files on the missing children were frustratingly vague. Presumed runaway, no foul play suspected. But cross-referencing dates and locations, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The disappearances often occurred on moonless nights, from homes on the outskirts of town or near areas with dense mesquite thickets or isolated cottonwood groves, places where something large and winged could approach unseen. My best chance, I realized, was to find someone who had already been touched by the tragedy, someone for whom the fear was a constant companion, not just a whispered dread. Following a discreet inquiry from Maria, who, despite her fear, seemed to possess a spark of defiance, I found myself on the porch of a small, weather-beaten house on the far edge of Ocaso. This was the home of the Alvarez family. Their 7-year-old daughter, Sophia, had vanished 3 months prior. Mrs. Alvarez, a woman whose face was etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have aged her decades, initially refused to speak to me. Her husband, a stoic man with calloused hands, stood protectively beside her. It was only when I mentioned I wasn't with the police, that I was looking into things others wouldn't, that a flicker of desperate hope, or perhaps just sheer exhaustion, crossed her face. They say it was LECHUZA," she whispered, her voice barely audible, tears welling in her eyes. "Sophia, she loved to play near the old cottonwood by the creek. She said she heard a lady singing there sometimes, a sad song." Her husband recounted a chilling detail. The night Sophia disappeared, he'd been awakened by a strange, whistling cry, unlike any bird he'd ever heard. Rushing outside, he'd seen a massive, dark shape lift from the cottonwood tree, too big to be an owl, too silent for any man-made craft. And then, silence. Sophia was gone. They showed me a single, unnaturally large, grayish-brown feather they'd found near the creek the next morning. It was unlike any feather I'd ever seen, coarse and stiff, with a faint, musty odor. I carefully bagged it. It wasn't definitive proof of a shape-shifting witch, but it was another anomaly, another piece that didn't fit the official narrative. The fear in their eyes, the raw, unhealed wound of their loss, was the most compelling evidence of all. Something terrible had visited Ocaso, and the townsfolk believed, with a chilling certainty, that it had wings. The Alvarez family's story and the strange feather solidified my unease. This wasn't just mass hysteria. There were too many consistencies in the accounts, too much genuine terror. That night, under a sliver of a crescent moon that offered little illumination, I began my own patrols. My objective wasn't to confront LECHUZA, not yet, but to observe, to gather concrete evidence that might pierce the veil of folklore. I focused on the areas mentioned in the testimonies. The outskirts of Ocaso, the dense mesquite thickets bordering the ranches, and particularly the stretch of creek near the old cottonwood where Sophia Alvarez had last been seen. The air was cool, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional, distant howl of a coyote, sounds that seemed to amplify the sense of isolation. Armed with night vision goggles, a high-sensitivity audio recorder, and my agency-issue pistol, I moved slowly, methodically. The night vision painted the landscape in eerie greens and blacks, transforming familiar shapes into alien forms. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. For hours, nothing. The vast, dark Texas landscape seemed to swallow sound and movement. I found a few animal tracks. Deer, raccoon, the telltale prints of a bobcat, but nothing out of the ordinary. The musty odor I detected on the feather occasionally drifted on the breeze, faint and elusive, making me wonder if it was a genuine scent or my own mind playing tricks. Then, near the muddy bank of the creek, I saw them. Two impressions in the soft earth, side by side. They were huge, far larger than any bird track I'd ever encountered, easily twice the size of a great horned owl's. Each print showed three thick, powerful talons facing forward and a smaller one behind, digging deep into the mud as if from a heavy landing. The span between them suggested a creature of considerable weight and size. My breath caught. These weren't animal tracks I recognized. I carefully photographed them, took measurements, and collected a soil sample. As I worked, a sudden, piercing cry ripped through the stillness of the night. It wasn't a coyote, nor any known bird of prey. It was a high-pitched, mournful wail, almost like a woman's drawn-out shriek of agony, yet with an unnatural, whistling undertone. It seemed to come from high above, somewhere in the inky blackness beyond the reach of my night vision. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I scanned the sky, my audio recorder already active. Nothing. The cry wasn't repeated, but the silence that followed felt charged, pregnant with unseen menace. The crickets had fallen silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A moment later, I heard a heavy whoosh of air directly overhead, as if something immense had passed just above the treetops. I looked up, but saw only the faint stars against the dark canvas. No silhouette, no discernible shape. But the disturbance in the air was undeniable. My skepticism, already battered, took another significant hit. The tracks were tangible. The cry was unlike anything I'd ever heard. The sensation of something large and unseen passing overhead was chillingly real. La Lechuza, or whatever was terrorizing Ocaso, was not just a figment of frightened imaginations. It was out there, and it was close. The enormous tracks and the unearthly cry solidified my belief. Ocaso was being stalked by something beyond the ordinary. The next day I sought out the oldest members of the community, hoping to find more than just fearful whispers, perhaps a deeper understanding of La Lechuza's origins. Maria, the diner waitress, hesitantly directed me to her abuela, Señora Herrera, a woman rumored to possess knowledge of the old ways, the curandera traditions that still lingered in these border towns. Señora Herrera lived in a small adobe house, surrounded by a garden of herbs that filled the air with a pungent, earthy aroma. She was ancient, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. She listened patiently as I recounted what I'd learned, showing her the photograph of the tracks and the strange feather. La Lechuza is not merely an owl, nor just a spirit, she said, her voice raspy with age, her Spanish lilting. She is a bruja, a witch, bound to that form by a great sorrow, a terrible betrayal, or a pact made in desperation. Sometimes, they say, she was a woman whose children were taken from her, and her grief twisted her magic into this monstrous shape. She seeks to replace what she lost, or to punish the world for her pain. She spoke of the Lechuza's intelligence, its cunning. It wasn't a mindless beast. It was a calculating hunter, drawn to the innocent, repelled by certain charms or rituals. Salt scattered on a windowsill, a broom placed upside down behind a door, the piercing cry of a baby, which was said to mimic her own lost children and drive her away in anguish. But these are protections, not solutions, Señora Herrera cautioned. To truly stop her, one must understand the heart of her curse, the source of her unending rage. She looked at me intently. Or, one must possess a strength that can break her, body and spirit. That night, armed with this new, unsettling knowledge, I returned to the area near the cottonwood tree by the creek. I didn't set out to confront her, but a part of me knew an encounter was inevitable. The air was heavy, the silence even more profound than before. It happened as I was examining a series of fresh scratches high up on the trunk of the cottonwood. too high for any common animal. A sudden, chilling whistle pierced the air directly behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Perched on a thick, low-hanging branch, not 20 feet away, was La Lechuza. It was immense, larger than any bird I had ever seen. Its wingspan easily 7 or 8 feet. The feathers were a mottled gray-brown like the one I carried. But it was the face that froze my blood. It wasn't the face of an owl. It was a distorted, grotesque caricature of an old woman's face. Skin like wrinkled parchment, a hooked nose, and eyes that burned with a malevolent yellow-orange light. They fixed on me with an unnerving, predatory intelligence. It let out another cry, a drawn-out, mournful wail that vibrated in my bones, filled with an ancient, unbearable sorrow, yet also a chilling promise of violence. The sound was paralyzing, a psychic assault that left me momentarily unable to move, my hand frozen halfway to my pistol. Then, with a powerful beat of its enormous wings that kicked up a cloud of dust and leaves, it launched itself into the air, disappearing into the blackness as silently and swiftly as it had appeared. The encounter had lasted mere seconds, but it had seared itself into my mind. This was no legend. This was a nightmare made real. The encounter with La Lechuza, the horrifying reality of its woman-owl visage, left no room for doubt. Ocaso was under siege by a supernatural predator. My report to whatever remnants of the agency might still be monitoring my encrypted channels would be chillingly concise. The immediate problem, however, was local and urgent. News travels fast in a small town. Even news people are terrified to speak aloud. The day after my encounter, a palpable sense of panic gripped Ocaso. Whispers of my sighting, a tall stranger who'd seen the Owl Witch, mingled with fresh fears. Then, the worst happened. Another child, a boy named Danny from a ranch on the town's western edge, went missing from his bed during the night. The only clue, a window found ajar and a single, large, gray feather on the sill. The town's fear turned into a desperate, frantic energy. The local sheriff, a man named Henderson who had previously dismissed the LECHUZA stories as old wives' tales, now looked gaunt and haunted. He had no answers, no resources to combat something like this. He quietly admitted to me that his own deputies were refusing to patrol the outskirts after dark. This was no longer just an investigation, it was a rescue mission, or at least a desperate attempt to prevent further tragedy. I couldn't stand by. That night, I met with a small, grim-faced group of ranchers and townsfolk, including Mr. Alvarez and Danny's distraught father. They were armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, their faces a mixture of terror and grim determination. They were ready to fight, but they were outmatched, targeting a creature of legend with conventional weapons. "She's smart," I told them, keeping my voice low and steady. "And she's not just an animal. Shooting wildly will only endanger us more." I outlined what Senora Herrera had told me about her potential weaknesses: the aversion to salt, certain prayers, the cry of a baby. It sounded flimsy even to my own ears, but it was all we had beyond brute force. We decided to set a watch, focusing on the remaining homes with young children, particularly those on the periphery of Ocaso. I couldn't shake the feeling that La Lechuza was growing bolder, perhaps even taunting us. The agency files I'd managed to decrypt years ago, detailing various cryptids, had a section on shapeshifters. Most were territorial, but some, particularly those driven by vengeance or a specific hunger, became more aggressive if their hunting grounds were threatened, or if they sensed weakness. As the moonless night deepened, an almost unbearable tension settled over our small, scattered groups. I positioned myself near a farmhouse where a young family lived, their fear a palpable presence in the darkened windows. The wind whistled through the mesquite, carrying sounds that played on the nerves, the rustle of unseen things, the distant cry of an animal that could be anything or nothing. Suddenly, from the direction of Danny's family ranch came a series of panicked shouts, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. Then, an eerie silence. My blood ran cold. La Lechuza had chosen its target, Or perhaps it was drawing us out. Leaving one of the ranchers to watch the farmhouse, I sprinted towards the sound, my pistol in hand, the vast, dark Texas sky pressing down like a suffocating blanket. The hunt had truly begun. The scene at Danny's ranch was one of chaos and fear. One of the watchers, a young ranch hand, was babbling incoherently, his rifle dropped in the dust. He'd seen giant wings and eyes like hellfire before firing blindly. There was no sign of Danny, and no sign of La Lechuza, only the lingering musty scent that now unmistakably signaled its presence. The creature was toying with them, a predator enjoying the terror of its prey. Back in my motel room, the dim light casting long shadows, I faced a grim reality. The makeshift patrols and scattered defenses were no match for a creature of La Lechuza's power and cunning. We needed a more direct approach, a way to either neutralize it or destroy it. My mind wrestled with Senora Herrera's words. Was there a woman trapped within that monstrous form, a victim of a curse who could somehow be freed? The fleeting, sorrowful intelligence I'd seen in its eyes during our brief encounter hinted at something more than just a ravenous beast. The agency's files, cold and clinical, classified such entities as, quote, Class 3 metamorphic predators, termination recommended. But the agency's solutions were rarely born of compassion. If there was a chance to break the curse, what would it entail? Understanding the heart of her sorrow felt like an impossible task with children's lives on the line. The legends were too varied, too ancient. Was there a specific object, a forgotten name, a ritual that could undo the transformation? The local lore offered few concrete answers beyond charms of protection. The alternative was stark. Treat La Lechuza as the monster it appeared to be and find a way to kill it. This felt more aligned with my past experiences, with the grim necessities of survival in a world teeming with things that preyed on humanity. But the thought of destroying something that might once have been human, however twisted, left a bitter taste. The agency's fragmented data on similar shapeshifters mentioned vulnerabilities, silver, certain sanctified objects, or extreme physical trauma targeted at a specific point during transformation, if such a window existed. It also noted that some could be bound or weakened by exploiting the core emotion driving their cursed state: grief, rage, betrayal. How did one weaponize grief? I examined the large gray feather again. Its structure was bizarre, almost reptilian at the quill. The musty odor seemed stronger now, as if imbued with the creature's essence. Could this be used somehow? My decision solidified. While the thought of freeing a cursed soul was a distant, almost romantic notion, the immediate threat to the children of Ocaso was too great. I had to assume the worst, prepare for a fight to the death. If an opportunity for something more presented itself, I would take it, but I couldn't count on it. I began to gather my resources. The agency pistol was loaded with standard rounds. I had no silver bullets. My combat knife was sharp. Senora Herrera had mentioned that La Lechuza, in its owl form, was still tied to the witch's human frailties if one could bypass its supernatural defenses. The challenge would be getting close enough, surviving its aerial attacks and its terrifying cry. I needed a plan, a way to lure it, to ground it, to face it on terms that weren't entirely its own. The old cottonwood tree by the creek, Sofia Alvarez's last known playground, felt like the right place. It was a site of its past success, a place it might feel drawn to. As the first light of another tense dawn broke, I began to sketch out a desperate strategy. The air beneath the ancient cottonwood tree was heavy with dread as night fell, thicker and more oppressive than any Texas heat. I'd chosen this spot carefully. It was where Sofia Alvarez had vanished, a place imbued with La Lechuza's predatory success, and hopefully, its arrogance. Mr. Alvarez and a few of the steadiest ranchers were positioned out of sight, a reluctant backup, their instructions clear: only intervene if I was down and out. This was primarily my fight. My preparations were meager but specific. I'd scattered a wide circle of coarse rock salt around the base of the tree, a traditional deterrent according to Senora Herrera. My agency pistol was ready, and my combat knife felt like an extension of my arm. The strange feather La Lechuza had dropped was tucked into my jacket, a grim token, perhaps even a focus. Hours passed in nerve-wracking silence. The moon, a pale sliver, did little to dispel the shadows. Then, the familiar, mournful whistle echoed through the darkness, closer this time, laced with an almost triumphant cruelty. My heart hammered. It knew I was here. A massive shadow detached itself from the inky sky, resolving into the terrifying form of La Lechuza as it swooped towards the cottonwood. It landed silently on a thick branch directly above me, its 8-foot wingspan casting an even deeper darkness. The grotesque, woman-like face peered down, those burning yellow-orange eyes fixing on me with cold, predatory amusement. "You came alone, little man," a voice rasped, not from its beak, but seemingly from the air around it, the same voice that had haunted the Alvarez home. It was ancient, filled with malice and a deep, echoing sorrow. "The children are not yours to take," I said, my own voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. La Lechuza let out a cackling shriek that scraped at my sanity. "They are all mine! All the lost ones! All the forgotten ones!" It launched itself from the branch not in a direct attack but in a circling, menacing glide, its huge talons extended. I stood my ground within the salt circle. As it swooped lower, I fired. The bullet struck one of its massive wings, eliciting a screech of pain and rage. It faltered midair, its flight becoming more erratic. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it was a surprise. It clearly hadn't expected resistance. It landed heavily just outside the salt line, its distorted human face contorted in a snarl. "You will pay for that!" It hissed and lunged, its talons tearing at the ground where the salt lay. It recoiled slightly, as if the salt caused it discomfort, but its sheer size and fury were overwhelming. This was my chance. While it was grounded, distracted, I charged, knife in hand. It met my attack with a swipe of its massive wing, the force of it sending me sprawling. Pain lanced through my shoulder. Before it could press its advantage, I rolled, coming up inside its reach and thrust the knife upwards, aiming for the juncture where wing met body, a point I hoped might be less protected. The blade bit deep. La Lechuza screamed, a sound that was both bird and woman, a shriek of pure agony and disbelief. It thrashed wildly, its powerful wings beating the air trying to dislodge me. I held on, driving the knife deeper. Black, Icarus fluid, not blood, sprayed from the wound. Its burning eyes, now filled with a dawning terror, locked with mine. For a fleeting instant, the monstrous features seemed to flicker, and I saw, or imagined I saw, the terrified face of a very old, very lost woman, trapped within. Then, with a final shuddering convulsion, the light in its eyes died. The massive body slumped, suddenly inert. The nightmare was over. The silence that descended after La Lechuza's final, shuddering cry was absolute. I lay on the ground, gasping for breath, my shoulders screaming in protest, the knife still clutched in my hand, slick with the creature's dark ichor. The immense, feathered body lay still beside me, already seeming to shrink, to lose some of its monstrous bulk as the unnatural energy animating it dissipated. Mr. Alvarez and the ranchers emerged cautiously from the darkness, their faces etched with disbelief and a dawning, fragile hope. They stared at the fallen creature, then at me, a mixture of awe and fear in their eyes. The terror that had gripped Ocaso for so long had finally been broken. As the first pale light of dawn touched the Texas sky, something strange began to happen to LECHUZA'S remains. The feathers turned brittle, crumbling to dust. The grotesque, woman-like features seemed to soften, to fade, until all that was left was a pile of desiccated bones, far too small to have belonged to the winged horror, and a scattering of coarse, gray-brown dust that smelled faintly of old parchment and deep sorrow. The curse, or whatever dark magic had bound it, had unraveled with its death. There was no sign of Danny, or Sophia, or the other missing children. LECHUZA, it seemed, had consumed them, body and soul. It was a bitter truth, a grim postscript to the night's victory. The immediate threat was gone, but the scars on Ocaso would remain, a testament to the lives lost and the terror endured. Sheriff Henderson arrived as the sun climbed higher, his face a mask of weary relief. There would be questions, reports to file, but the physical evidence of LECHUZA had conveniently vanished, leaving only my testimony and the collective memory of a town that had faced a nightmare. He seemed content to let the legend fade back into the shadows, a story to be told in hushed tones, its truth now cemented by its violent end. Before I left Ocaso, Senora Herrera sought me out. She pressed a small, hand-carved wooden owl into my palm. "You fought the darkness, and the darkness yielded," she said, her ancient eyes holding a flicker of gratitude. "But remember, there are many shadows, and some curses are born of a pain so deep they can never truly be broken, only silenced." Her words, and the small wooden owl, were a somber reminder. I had faced down another monster, another piece of the agency's shadowed world. The data fragment that had led me here was likely just another of their detached observations, another potential asset or threat cataloged and forgotten. They hadn't cared about the children, only about the phenomenon. As I drove away from Ocaso, the vast Texas landscape stretching out before me, I felt the familiar weight of exhaustion, but also a renewed, grim resolve. LECHUZA was gone, but the world was still full of such nightmares, many of them far more insidious, wearing human faces. My hunt for answers, for my own past, and for a way to fight the encroaching darkness the agency represented, was far from over. The cry of LECHUZA was silenced, but other, darker whispers still waited in the shadows.